Today's podcast is brought to you by Blue Canary. The bird has landed on beautiful Bainbridge Island, conveniently located at 499 Madison Avenue. ASE Master Technician Clint Ramsey brings over 15 years of experience, award-winning diagnostic skill, and a desire to reinvent the automotive repair experience. Schedule an appointment online at bluecanary.biz or call them today at 206-451-4220.
I'm Maria Metzler, the Executive Director of Helpline House. The global pandemic has affected us all differently. If you or your neighbors need food assistance, mental health counseling, rental assistance, or Parks and Rec vouchers, please reach out. Helpline House can help in many ways. Find us on the web at helplinehouse.org. It's what we do. Neighbor helping neighbor.
I got something for your mind, body, and soul. I got something for your mind, body, and soul.
You have found the B.I.STANDER Podcast. Now here's your host with the most, Tiny Tim.
What's good, Podcastville? You found the B.I.STANDER Podcast. Today on the podcast, I'm welcoming back our co-host, Joel Underwood. How you doing, Joel?
How you doing, man? Good to see you.
Good to see you as well. We also have the current mayor of Bainbridge Island, Rasham Nassar. How are you?
Hello, I'm well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm excited to learn more about Palestine. Out of sight, out of mind, I think. I'm going to come up with a lot of dumb questions just because I don't have the context of what goes on in Israel and Palestine and with Hamas and all that stuff. So I don't want this to be a terrible educational process, something kind of simple. And I'd also like to know more about your family's involvement and how you came to be the great mayor of Bainbridge Island. First question I would like to start with, and Joel, you can jump in anytime too. State versus country. What is Palestine specifically? Is it a religion? Is it a piece of land? Is it a state? Is it a country? All that's a little confusing from the outside in.
Yeah, well, definitely. Happy to talk about this. And of course, for those listeners that aren't aware by now, I am Palestinian. I'm actually first generation American Palestinian. My parents are both immigrants from Palestine to America. So the history of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is really close to home for me. And I grew up with a lot of kind of internal awareness of the conflict and its history, and really from both sides. So to answer your question, the Palestine is a state. It was officially recognized as the state of Palestine by the United Nations.
But as United Nations, are we still part of those groups that recognize Palestine?
It's a good question. I'm going to also state my disclosure here. I am not a historian by any means. I'm not an expert on the history of the conflict. Because it's so close to home and so personal, and I have lived personal experiences myself, and then also through my parents, I would say that my knowledge is less about the politics of what's happened and more about kind of the cultural and societal impacts on family.
Well, let's start there. As a child with your parents being immigrants, what kind of culture differences did you encounter growing up and them as people in the workforce in America?
Yeah, so I'll go back even further than my parents, because there's one strange kind of caveat to my Palestinian heritage that's a little tricky to explain, and it's surprising to a lot of people. My maternal grandmother, her name is Helen, is Pennsylvanian Dutch. My grandfather on my mother's side, he passed when I was 6. He, of course, Palestinian, had come over to the United States to attend the University of Pennsylvania, where he was earning a graduate degree in political science. So my grandfather was very politically involved in advocating for Palestinian rights, and was involved in conversations and discussions at the UN. He was also the mayor of the town that my parents are from, which is a small town in the West Bank called Deir Dibwan.
Deir Dibwan?
Deir Dibwan. It's spelled DEIRDIBWAN. I call it a town, but it's actually still recognized as a village. And for all intents and purposes, if you were to go visit, it would very much seem like a village, rather than what kind of we associate with being a town, a very developed town with core centers and things like that. So they met. She was I forget what you call them, the switchboard operators, back in the day. Yeah, you would have to call the operator, who would then connect you to the line you were trying to reach. That's what she did. While he was attending school, they met. Don't ask me how. I'm sure she's told me this story a million times. But they fell in love. And a few years after he graduated, and after the birth of my mother, actually, who was their third child, my mom was 4 at the time. She was born in Gettysburg. They took the boat back to Palestine, where they remained while they raised their children. And they ultimately ended up having 4 more. So my mom's from a very large family. My grandmother was the first American woman to ever live in Deir Dibwan, and maybe to ever live in that kind of general region of Palestine. So she had kind of a reverse cultural experience where she learned Arabic. She was kind of treated as an outsider, and eventually learned the trust and respect of the Palestinians in the village. So she's quite a remarkable lady and has incredible stories to tell. My father is from Deir Dibwan, so he was born and raised there. His mom was a goat herd. So just to give you an idea, like when I say village, I mean village. She kept a very large herd of goats in her home. Now her home is, and it's still standing. I actually had the opportunity to visit it 2 years ago. We went back. I think it was the summer of 2018. It's essentially carved from rock. And the way that villagers live was that the ground floor, kind of what they would consider the basement, was where the animals slept. And then above that is where the people slept. And the reason for doing that is, 1, to protect your animals at night from the risk of predators, but 2, also to heat the house.
Because heat rises.
Because heat rises. I don't know what it's like to sleep with a herd of 100 goats beneath you, but this very simply, no electricity, no running water. I have memories of watching my grandmother go fetch water from the well, memories of her baking bread in the outdoor oven, cooking fires, cooking meals was always done outdoors. Very interesting and very rural kind of life.
Yeah, simpler time. I remember as a kid going to the well, and there'd always be snakes just above the water line. You're like, what are you doing in here?
So, Rashem, you probably have family that has very, very vivid memories of the Al-Nakba, of the point at which, for people who are listening who aren't as up on the history of the region, around 1947, 1948, the British, as they so often did, decided that they knew best how the map should look, and redrew the map to the current sort of ideas of where Israel is. They were changing a lot of Middle Eastern countries at the time. And the Al-Nakba, and pardon me if I'm not pronouncing that right, but that's basically the expulsion, the movement of the Palestinian people to the current boundary lines. And for some reason, and we can talk about why that is potentially, a lot of people in the United States and all around the world, they know about the Holocaust and they know about lots of other racial and national awful things like the killing fields in Cambodia. But the Al-Nakba is something that does not get talked about a lot and doesn't really get taught in schools. And in fact, in Israel, you're not even supposed to mention it and talk about it. Do any members of your family, your parents, maybe aunts and uncles, have specific vivid memories of that time and the expulsion? And have they talked to you about them?
Yes, definitely. And they have, I mean, really early memories. And I think you're referring to kind of what really marked the start of the wider Arab-Israeli conflict. Mm-hmm. And what ultimately led to about 20 years later, the 6-Day War. And my family has very vivid,
I would think,
memories of that because my father wasn't present there and I could talk about the consequences of that to him, but my mother and my grandmother were. I mean, that just came about because I think it was like in the late 1890s, the 1917 Balfour Declaration, really began to create that tension in the region. So when these parties can't get along, tensions and conflicts just continued to rise. And when the attempts to solve the early conflicts, failed, that kind of all culminated into that 47-49 Palestinian War. And things have just sort of escalated on and off until then. The extent of the geographic regions that are the Palestinians are assigned to has diminished, as a result of their inability to come to a peaceable resolution of the conflict. But it's very complicated and it stretches back, 100 years, if not slightly more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And you said you had been there recently, just a couple of years ago?
I had, yeah. And I went in 2018. It was the first time I brought my family and my 2 small boys. My mom hadn't been back for quite a number of years. It was really difficult to travel while Trump was president. There were some restrictions. There were some closures of Palestinian embassies in the U.S. that just kind of made things difficult and untenable. So we ended up being able to go. And I say that it's difficult because, and this goes back to the 6-Day War. So my father was absent from Palestine during that time. He was in the United States. So my dad has put himself through a lot of different schools and a lot of different colleges and has earned a variety of degrees, ended up with a pharmacology degree. So he worked as a self-employed pharmacist for all of my life. But because he was absent during that time in which the occupiers, the Israelis, went around and did what they called a count. And I know it sounds silly, and I've talked to my mom about this. She has lived experience of this, just because it just seems a little unbelievable. But all the Palestinians that were present in the region got what's called a hawiyya. And that means that they have Palestinian citizenship. So my mom, because she was there and has Palestinian citizenship, she can go back to Palestine and live if she wanted. My dad was absent, so he did not get the same rights to Palestinian citizenship as my mother did. So when my father travels, he travels on his American passport, which gives him a 3-month visa to visit Palestine. And that was always a really sore spot for him and kind of led to now the more kind of personal consequences and repercussions that immigrants face when they leave their home countries. They often feel kind of trapped between 2 worlds, or they don't really belong in one, but they can't go back to the other. And so when we travel, and I travel, my sister as well, we are considered under our mother. It's a maternal kind of process when it comes to visas and travel. So we're treated differently. For example, I was telling Tim a little while ago that we rent a car, but because we're Palestinian and considered Palestinian, even though we have American visas and we're American citizens, we can rent cars that have green license plates. Green license plates means that you can't go to the places where the blue license plates can go, which are the Israeli license plates. So there's a lot of kind of I don't say like elements of apartheid, just separation and between the two, Israeli and Palestinian. And then there's other things. When we're at the airport, I was separated from my husband and my kids. And I had to undergo a different, more kind of intense search of my suitcase and my belongings. And my sister actually entered into Palestine from Jordan. She was held up at the border for over 24 hours while they searched Facebook page and social media accounts and questioned her as to why she was visiting the state.
Crazy. So I often think that the United States political system needs more than two parties. Is Israel a democracy like the United States? Netanyahu situation seems like there's three parties and they're going to split the duties between two. What kind of democracy is going on in Israel?
Well, that's a really good question. Again, my disclaimer, I'm not an expert here.
Right. I'm not.
But I think that they have executive authority in the state of Israel. They've got a minister, kind of like the British organizational structure for their government, where they have the minister and the prime minister. I'm not so terribly familiar about the kind of the construct of their government. Nor am I familiar with Palestinians and how they govern. And there's just been so much change and flux. I remember back, in my early childhood, being able to recall that there was a very clear Palestinian leader, right, in Yasser Arafat, and he was the chairman of he was chairman of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. He was the prime Palestinian kind of political leader, and it's difficult to say that Palestine has been able to replace that level of leadership in recent years. And I think that's just owed to the intense and long and ongoing conflict in the region. All that aside, I am a firm believer in let's just all get along. Having been back there is certainly enough land for everyone to share. And I think a lot of what we're seeing in kind of the younger generation is a move towards that. Yeah. When I was at UC Berkeley, I was involved in an organization that was a blend of Jewish people, Israeli nationals, and Palestinians. And our prime focus was just kind of to talk about the conflict and just to start to create a culture of collaboration and bridging the gaps between the two societies. And we're starting to see a lot of that in the younger voices as they emerge, which is really hopeful and inspiring.
Well, let's actually, if I could piggyback on that and ask, when Arafat and the PLO were even at their peak, even at his height of power, the complaint from a lot of people who were trying to broker peace in the region is we're not quite sure who to talk to because we don't know who can make agreements and keep them. Arafat would agree to this, and then, he couldn't either make his people listen or didn't have the authority to. And now we've got sort of an interesting situation with Hamas, where what's going on in the region is I think a lot of times mischaracterized as being Israel versus Palestine, when in fact, if you break it down, what we're really looking at is IDF versus Hamas. Do you think the average Palestinian citizen, either here in the United States or back there in the homeland, do they feel like Hamas speaks and acts for them? Or is Hamas something that they go, I don't know who these people are. They don't speak for me. They have their own agenda. How do you think they're looked at by the citizenry on the ground?
I think is exactly what you just said. They don't relate to their platform or their actions or activities at all. Most people just want to live in peace, and most Palestinians would welcome an opportunity for collaborative settlement of this issue of it. You think about the choice between living in fear and living in this kind of holding on to or grasping of the past, wanting things to go back to the way they were. It's peace becomes the priority. Safety becomes the priority. A lot of Palestinians have left the region, come to the United States to work, and still kind of retain some connection to the homeland, and maybe own a home there and go back over the summer. But they're not interested in the politics or the war. Most people aren't. Most people just want to live peaceably. And I find that's true with, for the other side as well. And I know that from personal experience, because I've yet to encounter someone who said that they agreed with the continuation of the conflict. I think so much happens when you get, when tensions escalate to the point at which they are, the people, the proponents behind them are so much smaller than the population of the people that they think they're representing.
Well said.
Yeah. And it just becomes a matter of, I'm right and you're wrong. No, I'm right and you're wrong. And then bombs are dropped and gunfire ensues. And who wants that? Nobody wants that.
This is the most elementary question I can ask, but I want to preface it. Like, I look at it and I see Palestine land is spread around West Bank, Gaza, stuff like that. It's not a defined border. It's not a defined country. It's a state. There's Palestinian people all over the world in large increments. There seems to be multiple religions and land issues. What is the fight about in the most basic common sense? Is it about religion? Is it about land? Is it about old school thinking? Is it about a holy land? Is it about just pure ignorance? I don't know. What is it?
Yes. It's everything you just said, man. It's all that stuff.
Yeah. I think we should get them on the phone and ask.
Exactly.
Remind them that, like, hey, do you even have a reason for why we're fighting anymore? Because
that's where I'm like, who's in charge of Hamas? Is it Kanye West I need to call, or who? It's like, put a face on it for me. Give me a hotline. Give me a Twitter account, something that I can communicate with.
Well, but here's I think, and this is where I think it relates, Tim, to what we're seeing in our own country in some ways,
very much
or what the Irish are dealing with in Northern Ireland, or let's look at India, Pakistan, whatever it is. We are seeing here, as we saw on January 6th, when the extremists of any conflict grab the steering wheel, it is really, really difficult, almost impossible, for the more moderate, thoughtful elements to grab it back. Because, no matter how extreme you are, you can count on the fact that there's somebody on the other side just as extreme as you. So perhaps I could ask our mayor, who has, spent some time in politics and leadership and all that stuff, how do you get the narrative back when you are more moderate? How do you get it back from people who feel so passionately, so strongly, and so extremely? How do you get control of events again?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And, I can honestly say that my experience on the city council has not really included or involved a situation or scenario that even very closely mirrors or mimics this extremist attitude that you just described. I think that, passions can become inflamed. Tensions do inflame and escalate. And, there's several ways to mediate in order to resolve that. And one is just to take a break, to take a pause. But, in order to do that, you need leadership. It all comes down to leadership. If you have a leader that can insert pauses, common sense, that can listen and hear both sides of an argument, and then mediate towards an amicable resolution that considers both parties' wants and desires, I think that there's no matter so great that can't be resolved. The problem is when you don't have that in leadership, when your leaders are the extremists. Then you're right. How do the masses get control? The way that we do in America is through our democracy. People organize, right? I mean, we saw that with the Black Lives Matter movement. People rally, they get together. And by the sheer mass of volume and voice, people can move leaders to act on their behalf, or they can get them out of office and put someone else in their place. I think in other parts of the world where we just see these ongoing conflicts and these ongoing wars, they don't have the ability to do that because their structure is so fundamentally different, which is what makes our democracy, especially our local democracy, so great, because the power really truly is in the hands of the people if they choose to exercise it.
Do you think America is contributing to the continuation of this issue in any fashion? Like, are that we supplying guns? Are we taking one side over the other? Are those type of issues prevalent?
I don't know how prevalent they are. I do know that at certain points in the recent past decade, maybe 2 decades, that America has supplied military equipment to Israel. The Israeli-American relationship is pretty strong. I think, though, that the Americans have done well to include the Palestinians in those conversations. I don't know how well, and it varies, upon who's in office. I know that under the Trump administration, there were some setbacks, and there was the instigation of yet another kind of tense battle over Jerusalem. So there's been some tightened restrictions around Palestinians' ability to visit Jerusalem. And there's some threat to the Dome of the Rock, which is the center, very, very valuable and in terms of its meaning to Palestinians and to Muslim Palestinians in particular, probably the most iconic structure in Palestine. And there was some tension there under the Trump administration that there was a desire to give all or a portion of that to Israeli control. I don't know if that's still going on, but it was something that I actually learned while I was entering the Dome of the Rock to go visit it, and had a conversation with a gentleman who quizzed me on my knowledge of the Quran, which you have to pass. My mom, crash quiz there. She brought me up to speed so that I could, have the right of entry and go visit that very historic and important mosque. But I learned a little bit about the tension there too. And so that was something that was more recent. But I know that Americans have played both sides. We see pictures of presidents, Clinton shaking the hands of both leaders in the same room at the same time. So I'm sure a lot of negotiations have happened behind closed doors that have involved both parties. In terms of funding, I'm just not aware right now how much that America is providing support to Israel, if they're providing support to Palestine. I just don't know.
Well, isn't this kind of where, and I'm going to use a very controversial word here, isn't this where anti-Semitism comes into play? Because nobody wants to be called anti-Semitic. And before Tim and I get hate emails and hate letters, let me be very, very clear. Anti-Semitism is real. It's out there. It's ugly. It's awful. But in the past, I think, especially in America and especially in American government, as soon as you in any way questioned Israel or the government of Israel's actions or any of their stuff in terms of settlement or anything, the first word out of the hip was, well, you're anti-Semitic. You're being anti-Semitic. Do you think that maybe we're entering now a period where, I won't say a majority, but a critical mass of people in America are starting to feel like, wait a minute, I can be, let's say, anti-Netanyahu, and it doesn't mean I'm anti-Semitic. I can be anti-settlement, and it doesn't mean I'm anti-Semitic. Is that something that maybe we're starting to see cracks in?
I think so, but I would phrase it a little differently.
Sure.
I think that what we're seeing is a move away from that terminology, period, and a move towards just humanity. I think people are not, anti-Semitic or not, or pro-Palestinian or not. I think you're pro-human life and pro-human rights or not. I think you're for equality, equity, and fairness or not. And I would say most people generally are. And those are the same kind of threads of advocacy that we're seeing in values that we're seeing in the Black Lives Matter movement, that I have direct, interaction with through our race equity advisory committee on the island, when we think about and talk about Native American history as well. It becomes more a matter of having positive relationships with our fellow man, wanting the same for others that we want for ourselves, seeing the humanity in other people. And when you start to see that, war, pain, suffering, it just doesn't belong. So I think that's kind of where, the younger generation especially, and we've seen this, resurgence of love, the love movement, the Beatles, and it wasn't about classifying groups and then advocating for their rights over someone else. It was about love. It was about equality. It was about the end of war.
That's very well said, Rashem. It, to me, blows me away. There's all these religions fighting over this land, and I feel like religion is based in kindness to our neighbor, in believing in a God of your right, your choice, higher power, whatever. There should be no negativity around, hey, you have a different belief, or you have a different belief, or you're another religion. We're all human. So I really feel like you do that human rights really needs to be the main religion for everybody. Treat people with kindness, fairness, and how you would like to be treated.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better myself. And I think that we often get stuck on the leader, the person, him or herself, the identity, right? The name, the history. And what we forget in doing that is the values that they represented, the values that they reflected. So it's not so much of a question of like following the leader, but seeking to mirror, imbue, embody the values that they led with: compassion, kindness, generosity, because you find that in every religion around the world.
Yeah, and I think we need to seek out the things that we meet in the middle with more often and highlight those, because it seems like extremists seems to be the norm now. You're anti-abortion or you're pro-life. It's the extremist viewpoint. It's not everything, the 99% that we agree upon down the middle. That's not highlighted, talked about, or engaged. It's always you against me, red against blue. Palestine, not really against anybody. I should say Israel versus Hamas.
Well, and not even Israel. I would, and by the way, we should say at this point, folks, probably that our goal is that this is the first half of a two-part conversation. We hope to, in the coming weeks, have someone on the air with us here who really hardcore represents the Israeli point of view in this as well. But even that is a bit of a misnomer, because as we've said earlier in the conversation, it is not if you pulled the average citizen off the street in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, or wherever, they would probably say that Netanyahu and Likud and the IDF don't represent me either. That they're not interested necessarily in settlement and some of the more extreme things that are going on here. Now, just in the couple of days, let's see, we're recording this as I look down at the corner of my screen here it's June 4th. It looks like Netanyahu is going to be gone. It looks like that his party has been unable, or he has been unable to create a coalition to build a government, which is how their parliamentary system works. And it looks like he is now, for the first time in decades, on his way out. Though a lot of people have gone broke underestimating Bibi Netanyahu. Do you think that the exit of Netanyahu from the stage is going to change things and calm things down? Do you think this is going to make a difference, or is it going to be same stuff, different name?
I mean, that's a really good question. I think it's definitely going to bring change. What kind of change has yet to be seen. But when you still have these extremist parties that are still fighting, from a place of anger and a place of lack, that are wanting things that are just unreasonable at this point in the history of this affair. I hope that there's a leader in place soon, for both sides' sake, that is going to lead from a place of compassion and kindness, and not support or encourage this ongoing war. Change is definitely coming, though, in light of Netanyahu's apparent impending departure. But we'll see. I mean, the Palestinians have been here before. The country has seen this before, where there's a thread of hope. I think under the Clinton administration, there was movement towards signing a peace treaty, and everyone thought this could be the end, but it wasn't. So much is still outside of any leader's control, because the situation has just escalated to a point of almost no return. That said, it's really about movements of the people. And it's really about, training these younger generations, and they're actually training us on how to look at it through a lens of humanity. Both Jewish people, Israelis, Palestinians have a right to live there. And there are some people that you talk to, you ask, do you think they could ever live together in peace? And I asked these questions of Palestinians when I was on the street, in my very rough Arabic, and a lot of them said yes. And you ask the same question of Jewish Americans, or I had a conversation with some Israeli soldiers as well. They, at the checkpoints. And they're younger. They're 18 to 20 something when they obligated to serve in the military. Mostly super friendly, very respectful. Yes, sir. No, sir. Yes, ma'am. No, ma'am. Incredibly polite. And I could just get the sense that they're living out this narrative that no one really agrees with. It's just been imposed upon them. So everyone is kind of acting the part. But I think as these younger generations begin to grow up and realize they have a choice and they have a say, and that they can take control over their future and really force the leaders to make decisions that are consistent with their vision for that future, a future that does not involve war, does not involve gun violence, that maybe the fences can come down.
You said something that really radiated with me. You said threat of hope. And that's flipping the entire paradigm around in my mind. It's like, aren't we seeking to give people something to live for, that hope, as opposed to constant conflict? It's such an old school way of thinking. Like, it's never love thy neighbor or coexist and stuff like that. And I think the youth is really where we need to attack this situation, because they're more educated than ever. The education my son gets compared to the education I got, leaps and bounds. So now true whole history is being spoken to the kids, and they can see where things went south, and they don't want to have that continue. So I really think that thread of hope comes through the youth, and hopefully it's a glowing beam of hope.
Yeah, for example, there's some, and I mentioned earlier that, counter to what maybe you might glean just from watching the news and witnessing the conflict, there's a lot of Palestinians in America.
Yeah.
And a lot of Palestinians are educated at American institutions. Some of them go back and live in Palestine, and they take those skills with them to help, to help lift the Palestinians and to lift the spirits and to carry that thread of hope. I learned about, when I was there, talking back about the village and coming out of this very rural life where there are still houses in existence that accommodate animals on the ground floor. Palestinian lawyers trained in the U.S. and practicing in the U.S. have provided free services to Palestinians who own land to actually register that land. And that might sound silly because we're so familiar with title and deed, and our purchase and sale of property is so documented and public records. And, we have contract law, which protects interests on both sides. And Palestinians haven't had that. They don't have that infrastructure. That's kind of societal legal infrastructure. They're just now starting to develop it, but they're developing it. And that's providing them a sense of ownership of the lands that they have, and getting them a foot in the door in terms of negotiating from a more neutral standpoint. So that's something that I witnessed that's really kind of becoming apparent in its effect to provide that sense of hope. You can actually go into the mayor's office now in the Palestinian village and ask for aerial photography of a site, and they have it marked down. And this is like when my dad saw that, just in 2018, he couldn't believe it. His jaw dropped to the floor, because just decades prior, it was a book with pencil handwriting, and it said, this land belongs to this person. That was it. There's no computer, there's no parcel map drawn. It was just kind of it was kind of an honor system thing. Like, everyone knew that was your piece of land, and everyone knew, people knew not to touch it, kind of a thing. But it's definitely helped lifting the Palestinians, I think, into the modern era, and giving them that sense of confidence that I think they've struggled to retain.
That seems like a very important step. Sorry if I cut you off there, Joel, but
no.
I don't understand the land taking. There seems to be some law in the books where if you were to leave and come back, I don't know the gist of it, but it seems like Palestinian people are being displaced from some of the land that they believe to know. Do either of you know what I'm talking about? Can either one of you pontificate on it?
Well, first, yes. I mean, yes. The answer to your question is yes. And that sort of brings me back around to what you were talking about with the idea of the thread of hope. Don't kid yourself. There are some people for whom hope and peace is a threat. Any long going, look around the globe, any conflict that's been going on this long, that is still going on, it wouldn't be going on if there wasn't and sometimes it's a very small group, but if there weren't people who had something to gain by keeping it going. There are people whose power, whether it's the Hood or whoever, or maybe it's the Orange Order in England, whatever.
Maybe it's America selling guns to all these.
And exactly, it can be a financial gain. It can be a political power gain. It can be an aristocracy and caste system gain. It can be whatever, but there's always going to be people who, when a conflict has been going on this long, it is going on that long in part because there are some people who have a lot to gain by keeping the status quo going. And I'm glad that Rashem has had terrific interactions with the IDF. I've had very different interactions in that I've had students who have left me and gone over there to be in the IDF as citizens and spend their couple years doing it, and who left me as, in my opinion, beautiful, wonderful, three-dimensional kids who have come back to visit me. This has happened on a couple separate occasions, and everything was going great until I asked the wrong questions about what was going on over there and heard incredible racist vitriol and language about Muslims and Arab citizens and Palestinians that I will not offend people by repeating here. And I kind of go, what happened? Oh my God, you are not who you were when you left me. And the indoctrination there is there, and it's real, and it's strong. And I have to say, I've never worked a checkpoint and had people coming by me that I'm wondering, does this person have a bomb or a gun and wants to kill me? I can't put myself in those shoes, but it's real. And there are people and there are forces in any conflict who have something to gain by keeping it going. So I guess my question to Rashem would be, is part of sort of defusing this bomb, and it sounds like maybe at Berkeley you did some studies into this and some look into this, is the first step deconstructing it and looking at who's got something to gain by keeping it going, and how is that process working?
Well, yes. And I mean, absolutely. There's always private interests involved, especially when you're talking about war. I mean, all war is for a reason, right? And there's usually someone who's a very small group of people or a corporation or some industry that stands to benefit from it. And that's pretty well known. I mean, I think I became aware of that probably during my time at UC Berkeley. When I became, kind of awakened to the realities of our world and the business of war and how much profit is made, essentially from the death and destruction.
And the rebuild.
And the rebuild. Exactly. I mean, it's a business for all intents and purposes. I don't like calling it that, but yeah, you definitely have private interests involved. And that's true of everywhere. That's true of everything. And we're seeing that with the Black Lives Matter movement too. this push for equity and this kind of advocacy and drive to have more people of color in positions of power. And the opposition that folks are facing to that is pretty shocking and revelatory of the problems in the inherent structure of our society, where historically marginalized populations continue to be left out of those rooms and those discussions. And there's a reason for that. And it really revolves around power, because when you're in the position to make the decisions, there's a lot of power there. Mm-hmm. And power is not something that people want to give up. Mm.
I don't want it at all.
What do you mean you don't want it at all? What is that?
I've been around some people that are very powerful, and it's changed their whole personality and their value set. You know, it's always chase, as opposed to just be calm, love your family, love your neighbor, do your thing. You don't have to max it out to the extreme all the time. That's the type of power I'd love to have the power to inspire, but not the power to rule over someone. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I really like that. I think that when you have power and wield it in the wrong way, that your drive or your motivation becomes around protecting and preserving that power, which means that, you're now operating from a basis of excluding other people. That power is coming from somewhere. And it's usually coming at the expense of those that don't have equal rights or opportunities mm-hmm. that you've had, which has, landed that person in that position of power. And then it just becomes a game of protecting it. And sometimes that involves war.
Well, and there's a political science school of thought that says power begets fear, because the idea is you cannot have power without then creeping in behind it the fear that you're going to lose that, and you are willing to do sometimes some very extreme. I mean, look, you guys live on Bainbridge Island, right? All around you is you've got this beautiful cultural center of what happened in World War II, when the white power structure in America was afraid, and we took American citizens, and we locked them up in camps down at the Puyallup State Fair, and we pulled American citizens from their homes, basically out of fear. And yet we were at the time arguably the most powerful country in the world. So the question really becomes, can you have power and at the same time have the calmness to not worry about whether or not you're going to lose that power or not? I mean, they say that a United States congressman, from the day they get elected, has to raise $10,000 a week to run for re-election the next time. I mean, as long as that's the case, that's why, because most of what you're doing is the fear that you're not going to keep having that power, the fear that you're not going to keep having that job. It's
crazy.
Yeah, I think the if you look at like who are like our most notable kind of global leaders have been, and I'm thinking Martin Luther King Jr., I'm thinking Gandhi, I'm talking about Nelson Mandela, people that have led from a place of compassion and love, where they had a lot of power, they had power of influence, but they just wielded it well because it wasn't coming from a place of fear, it wasn't coming from a place of anger, hostility. It was coming from a place of love, and having that power to them and distributing it meant sharing it. And by virtue of doing that, by breaking down those barriers and allocating that power out into the world, into the community, actually reciprocally empowered them even more. They grew even greater in influence and their ability to cause change. So we often don't think of it that way because it's really hard to trust. It's really hard to follow a path of heart when we are also struggling, and there is so much suffering, and there is a lot of pain in our world. And, especially with COVID and the job insecurity that so many Americans have faced, food scarcity. I mean, these issues are really real, and it's
transitional housing. Absolutely.
It's a really great challenge, but I think for the most part, a lot of people do it really well. And I especially see that on Bainbridge Island. I mean, we have these free exchange of things on social media sites. People are always willing to come and lend a hand and help. That really deep sense of community, which is primarily built upon a foundation of trust. The alternative leads to very different and very bad things.
Well, you mentioned 3 people there, and the sad thing is the 3 people that you just mentioned are no longer with us. Who's out there who's doing it right? Who do you look to in terms of leadership right now as kind of your role models and people who you think are doing things the right way on a large scale?
Okay, I'll tell you an embarrassing fact. But when for example, when I'm on the city council and I have to confront a really difficult debate, or I'm thinking about an issue that's contentious, I go on YouTube and I watch Obama.
That's totally cool. Yeah.
That's what I do, because he speaks from that place of heart. He reaches people, and he brings people together. And I aspire to be that in leadership. I haven't always done it perfectly, but when my approach to my job, my approach kind of to career, to the things that I want to do is inspired by that quality of leadership, by those values in leadership, which are good values, which take into consideration all of humanity, not just some aspect of it, leading from that place of heart. So now you know that about me.
That's totally cool. Are there women? Is there who
Michelle
from that side? I mean, Michelle. Some people might say
that because it's true.
Yeah. No, I love Michelle, but I mean,
she's on my Mount Rushmore guest that I like the most.
Is there an AOC? Is there an Elizabeth Warren? Is there somebody who you look at as a woman and go, that she's doing it right? She's speaking for me.
I got one answer if I can jump in because it's fresh in my mind. Is Amanda Gorman.
Oh, she was great.
The poet, the young poet. She radiates teachable moments for youth, I think. Her words are strong. Her delivery is powerful. But what she says is even better. And if you can glean the teachable moments from her public speaking, I think she can move mountains.
Yeah. Well, again, my my easy answer was Michelle, but that was too easy. But I draw from a lot of women leaders, and especially women female politicians. Especially AOC, Elizabeth Warren. I watch them talk a lot and I listen to their strength, and I hear their angles and how they approach personal, discussions. I know AOC has been on the floor and talked about instances where she's felt discriminated against or targeted, has really represented herself well. And I think that a lot of women find support in watching her encounter the challenges of being a young female politician in a predominantly, male-dominated, white-dominated world. Elizabeth Warren is harsh. She has that ferocity that I think women need sometimes. We kind of all need that sometimes, especially when what you're fighting for is so good that you need a little bit of an element of strength. You need to exert that point because you believe in it so strongly, and you know that the majority of people believe in it so strongly too. So I borrow from a lot of women and leaders. I have people in my personal life. I have friends that have modeled, good qualities and leadership qualities, both in my personal life and then in my professional life as well. Employers, one, Laura Camp, she gave me my first job out of restaurant work, which was a really exciting and long overdue transition for me. I think it was 24, 25. And I started, getting out of that restaurant world and into something different is something that most cocktail waitresses and bartenders and servers that I worked with wanted to do, and they ended up being career waiters or waitresses. We always walk around, moaning and griping about our jobs. And I found a mentor in a woman whom I met through a yoga teacher training, who offered me a job managing her fitness studio because she saw something in me that I didn't even necessarily see in myself. So she helped develop some managerial skills in me, business skills, and modeled kind of a compassionate approach to business, which was really interesting. So pulling a lot of the things we talked about, kindness, compassion, into all relationships, including business ones. So she's a really important person in my life, and I still communicate with her. And if I have a tough question or I'm not quite sure how to tone a specific email that's a hard email, I rely on the people in my life that have historically served as mentors, as guides, to help advise me on that.
So now we tie it all together. Watch how we do this. This is going to be a high degree of difficulty dive, but I think we can do it. If you look, and this is my personal soapbox, if you look at all these intractable things we're talking about around the world, things like Israel, Palestine, things like India, Pakistan, and what's going on in Ireland and all that, you see largely in control men. Mm-hmm. Do you think if in the Israeli-Palestinian situation, if we had more women at higher levels of government on both sides, and I'm not saying women can't be radicalized, women have been, women will be, do you think we would be looking at a better, more hopeful situation?
Yes.
Because I do. I think the more women, I think history is on my side when I say the more women you have in charge at higher levels of government, the more peaceful things are.
Yeah. Tim, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah.
I want to say yes. I respect my wife. I respect my mother. There's a certain nurture to discipline ratio that men don't always give. So I think there's a good chance it's better for the future. I wouldn't say it's not. That's for sure.
Well, I mean, it's a really interesting question. I think it's deserving of a whole other podcast. I'm happy to come back and have that conversation.
We can talk about that.
Because I'm a mom of 2 young boys. And I've read a lot of parenting books on boys and learn about their, how they learn differently and
different brains.
The brains are different, and there's some fundamental kind of biological differences between male and female.
Absolutely.
That are good to talk about, especially when we talk about who's better to be in power, women or men. I think the problem is not the gender of the person in charge.
It's the quality of it.
It's the quality. And I think that what we often see is that people who are attracted to positions of power want it for themselves. So what we have to do, female or male or, gender neutral, it really doesn't necessarily matter the person, but the intent behind the person, why they're seeking that position of power. What platform are they running on? Question them, find out, why is it that they want to serve? Why is it that they want to wield control? If their reasons are genuine, if they are truly interested in performing service in the interest of the community and not there for selfish personal reasons, then I think gender doesn't really matter because their intent is pure. Their heart is in the right place. That's really difficult to find because kind people, good people don't want the messy, kind of hurtful and very difficult life or consequences that come from being in a position of power. It's really hard to be in a public, to be in the view of the public, to be in a public role. It can get really personal. It can get really difficult. There's its own unique challenges, both political and then, professional consequences as well, potential personal consequences, impacts on family. And you can ask any council member. It's a really hard position to be in. And I can't imagine that difficulty only rises the higher up in office you go. And so finding people that are good, that have good intentions, that are pure of heart, that are really wanting to serve, to make the world a better place, that are ready to make, good on their promise to bring more equity, more fairness, more respect, more professionalism into our world, to give a voice to the people, to represent the values of the people, can be hard to do. But we're seeing that now. the trend that I'm seeing with AOC, we have Tara Simmons over here in the 23rd Legislative District, is that people are stepping up because there's so much at stake. And we're not just talking about war. We're not just talking about, social, disputes between groups of people about discrimination, ongoing discrimination, racial inequities. We have climate change to contend with. We have environmental toxicity that is becoming very real and very alive. We have concerns about water and water resources. These are all coming. These are all realities. And it's so important to start to fight for those things, to have good people in place to make policies that are going to help curb some of the impacts of those realities they're upon us. And I think people are more and more inspired to say, it's worth it. It's worth it for me to do this. It's worth the risk. It's worth the harm. It's worth the challenge. I'm ready to step up and do this. And then the more that happens, the more people will follow behind them. So every time you have one of those people come into a position of power, it shows everybody else in the community, hey, I can do that too. If she did it, I can do that too. And that's been one of probably, I'll try not to cry when I say this. One of the most special parts of being on the city council has been having conversations with our youth, with high school students, with people in their early 20s that are kind of figuring things out. And when I tell them my personal story, when I tell them my background and the life that I came from and the personal challenge and adversities that I faced and how I never gave up and I kept moving forward. Yeah, there's suffering. Yeah, there's pain, but you find a goal, you pick a goal and you follow it no matter what happens along the way. You never give up on yourself and you grow because of it. Look at it like a good thing. Take the lessons from it and use them and apply them and continue to apply yourself. And inspiring those voices to the table and having them find their way into City Hall, finding their way up to that mic to comment on a piece of legislation that's before the council, I think has been one of the most rewarding experiences of service for me.
That's very well said. Rasham Nassar, Mayor of Bainbridge Island, thank you so much for your time today. It was a great discussion.
Thank you so much for having me. This was really fun. Let's do it again.
You bet.
For sure. Joel Underwood, thank you for your time.
Oh, it was great to be here, man.
I'm looking for episode 2 from your podcast. So let's get on the road, buddy.
Get there.
And then I'd like to thank the nice people at Blue Canary Auto, the support I get from Helpline House, all the Patreon Podcastville that supports the monthly show, and who's last? Mudwater. Go drink that coffee alternative. Get those mushrooms in your life. You've been listening to Bystander. Thank you. Be kind.